Hello, you are watching Middle East Matters here on France 24. I'm Nadia Massih. This week in the show, a deep dive into the United Arab Emirates, a country whose geopolitics are in flux as the Iran war brought conflict closer to the skyscrapers and luxury lifestyle of Dubai than few had ever imagined. Since the 28th of February, no country has been hit harder by Iranian drones and missiles, not even Israel. And in response, the UAE now appears to be moving closer to the Jewish state. Emerald Maxwell has our report.
Of all the Gulf states, the United Arab Emirates has borne the brunt of Iran's attacks during the war, including one last Sunday that caused a fire at Barakah, the country's only nuclear power plant. The Emirates has publicly sharpened its language against Iran, saying that it reserves the right to respond after what it called a serious escalation. The war is also bringing the UAE closer to Israel, a rapprochement that began before the war with the US-mediated Abraham Accords in 2020, but has grown despite Israel's belligerence. Last week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he made a secret visit to the Emirates during the war, where he met with President Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, calling it an historic breakthrough in relations. The claim was swiftly denied by Abu Dhabi.
The United Arab Emirates denies reports circulating regarding an alleged visit by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the UAE. The UAE reaffirms that its relations with Israel are not based on non-transparent or unofficial arrangements.
The two countries are reportedly establishing a fund to jointly develop new weapons systems. This after the US ambassador to Israel confirmed the country had sent its Iron Dome air defense batteries and personnel to the UAE during the war.
I think that the UAE is an example. They were the first Abraham Accord member. But look at the benefits that they have had as a result. Israel just sent them Iron Dome batteries and personnel to help operate them.
Iran has accused the UAE of colluding with Israel and of allowing US forces to use its bases for attacks. Abu Dhabi is charting its own path diplomatically, but also in energy. It exited OPEC this month and has sped up the construction of a second crude pipeline, which would allow it to bypass the Strait of Hormuz and double its export capacity, even if it puts it at greater odds with Saudi Arabia and its neighbours.
To talk a little more then about all of this, Andreas Krieg joins me on the programme. He's an expert in the Gulf region at King's College London. Hello to you and thanks for speaking to us here on France 24.
Good afternoon.
Can I ask you, first of all, just simply why it is that you think that the United Arab Emirates has been attacked more than any other country by Iran in this conflict?
What Iran is doing here is fighting a war against global economy. It's trying to hold the global economy for ransom because they know that's the weak spot, that's the Achilles heel, through which it can exercise leverage over the United States, over Europe, over Asian states as well. And obviously, if you look at where the UAE are positioned geographically, kind of wedged between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but also right on the brink of the Strait of Hormuz. If you then look also at the financial connectivity, the UAE is the most connected Middle Eastern country in terms of finances, in terms of trade, commodities, goods, people as well as data. So attacking the UAE right on the doorstep of Iran is a way to immediately hit one of the key hubs in the global economy, in particular Dubai. And so it's an easy target. It was fairly vulnerable, not as well defended as Israel. And it didn't require much to exercise pressure that would then come to bear, at least in theory, on the United States and other partners in the West.
Well, let's talk about the response then of the United Arab Emirates. What do you make of something we saw in that report we played that Benjamin Netanyahu visited Abu Dhabi? That's something that the government there denied pretty quickly, but does it seem plausible to you?
Well, there is a lot of forensic evidence from that period in March, where you can see one of the jets that's been used by Netanyahu before, having traveled to the UAE and back, and that kind of corresponds to the data that was given by the Israelis. The problem here is that the Israelis obviously are manipulating it. And when I say the Israelis, particularly Netanyahu, is politically manipulating that to advance his own interests politically, to show that he is a statesman, that he's not as isolated as he actually is, that he was even in wartime, a war that Israel started, was able to meet with Arab leaders, which is something that obviously is extremely sensitive within the UAE at a time when the whole relationship of the UAE with Iran, but also the UAE with Israel is under a lot of scrutiny domestically, and there's a lot of debate on where the country is supposed to go, where Abu Dhabi wants to go, and where the other Emirates want to go. So at this time, it comes at a very sensitive time, and I think what the Israelis are trying to do here is to put pressure as well, and potentially drive a wedge in relations between the UAE and the rest of the region and the rest of the GCC, when obviously Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other GCC countries are trying to rally the Gulf countries around a coherent response to the Iranian threat, and also kind of build a common front line rather than relying on external actors to say we need a common Gulf response.
And is that Israeli strategy then of trying to drive a wedge between the UAE and the rest of the Gulf working then? Because there have been tensions, haven't there, between the UAE and Saudi Arabia? I wonder where you think we are now.
Well, these tensions for the moment between Saudi Arabia and the UAE are buried, but they're only buried for the moment because, you know, there is this old Arab saying that me and my brother against my cousin, me and my cousin against the stranger. And that's kind of what's happening here. There's a lot of negative integration within the Gulf, currently saying we are threatened by Iran. We need to respond to that crisis, and we're better off doing it together. And it doesn't help if each of the Gulf states is pulling into opposite directions. Gulf positions are somewhat on a spectrum, with Oman on one side that are very fully pushing towards closer alignment with the Iranians, and the Emiratis on the other end of the spectrum who don't want any alignment with Iran and potentially favor an alignment with Israel. But we also need to be very careful that relationship between Israel and Abu Dhabi in particular is one that is mostly operational. It's about what the UAE can get out of Israel in terms of technology, in terms of military support, security support, access to technology, but it's not necessarily a strategic alignment in the way that Israel would like it to be. I don't think anyone in Abu Dhabi would be naive enough to think that a relationship with Israel could in any way compensate for what is a relationship with common neighbors with whom you share a joint geography as well as a regional security framework that is ultimately determined by geography. And Israel is just too far away to make a difference.
That's interesting. So you don't think that there is a sort of big reset now in terms of the geopolitics of the United Arab Emirates, where it is trying to pull away from its Gulf neighbours and look more directly towards Israel, whether that is in security cooperation or economically?
I think we need to differentiate between the narrative that the UAE is projecting to the world, because the UAE has been victimized very much by Iran. They've suffered quite disproportionately in comparison to other Gulf states, and even in comparison to Israel in terms of damage done to its economy, to its economic model. And what the UAE is trying to do is now project strength as well, pushing out that narrative of defiance, of assertiveness, and also suggesting to the United States that it's doubling down on the US, it's doubling down on the relationship with Israel, because they can score points with that, particularly in the United States with Trump. But in reality, however, there are a lot of push and pull factors within Abu Dhabi and within the UAE. I mean, it's a federation of seven emirates, and there's a lot of push and pull going on in terms of defining that relationship. And nobody is pushing for the severing of relations with Israel, but equally, it's not a consensus of saying we're doubling down on Israel now, because ultimately that will come at the expense of relations with, especially with Saudi Arabia, that feels the relationship with Israel has gone too far and is now feels surrounded by bases of Israel in Yemen and in Somaliland, in Sudan, in the UAE. And so the UAE have to tread very, very carefully in terms of how they forge that relationship. And one thing we shouldn't forget in all of that is that, yes, Israel has come operationally, tactically to support the UAE, but ultimately they came as the arsonist who then appeared as a firefighter, because the war was started by Israel for Israeli interests and very much against the interest and to the detriment of the UAE. And that's something that has certainly not gone unnoticed in Abu Dhabi.
And another aspect of this that you touched on in your answer a few minutes ago was about how this kind of relationship with Israel may be being perceived by the Emirati public. I mean, for decades now, haven't we? We've had Arab states sort of paying lip service to the Palestinian cause, the idea of a Palestinian state. And I wonder whether you think this reporting, unconfirmed, that Netanyahu had been to visit, that ties were improving, is something that could generate some anger among the Emirati public.
It certainly does. And I think we have to differentiate between Abu Dhabi, which is the most dominant, the richest emirate of the seven, that has very little to lose from this current war. It has a lot of financial wealth to back it up. It doesn't have a service-based economy. It's only based on the export of oil. And so far, Abu Dhabi is still able to export some oil. The problem are really the northern emirates that are reliant on a service-based economy. They're reliant, particularly Dubai, on choke points being open, of trade corridors to remain open. And so they've suffered disproportionately. And in that difference as well comes towards, it's really coming to the forefront when it comes to discussing relations with Iran, where northern emirates are now saying, people in the northern emirates are saying, we've had relations with Iran for centuries as a merchant class. And Abu Dhabi says, we don't want this. When it comes to Israel as well, in the northern emirates, we've seen a major difference among people who also see that this is, yes, a pragmatic relationship, but certainly not a wholehearted one, not a warm one. This is a very cold, very pragmatic relationship. And the events of Gaza over the last 3 years have really brought this back home for most people in the Northern Emirates in particular, who think outside the box and say, actually, this is not the sort of country, this Netanyahu's Israel is not the country that we want to support and that we want to ally with. And I think so there is friction. But I think what Abu Dhabi has achieved is kind of creating a lot of deterrence in terms of publicly debating these sort of sensitive issues. Most of it remains under the radar and within very confined private spaces. Very little of that has actually come to the forefront in terms of public discourse.
Yeah, and that's fascinating, what you were talking about, the kind of tensions between the different emirates over this. Just a final thought for you, if we can, on oil and on OPEC. We had that shock decision by the United Arab Emirates that they were leaving OPEC a couple of weeks ago. How do you think that feeds into this broader conversation that we're having?
This is about the broader conversation about autonomy and this kind of very desperate attempt by Abu Dhabi to kind of forge its own destiny and its own path forward, potentially without relying on the Gulf, potentially on its own, suggesting they're a middle power when in reality, materially, they're still a fairly small state with certain limits in terms of capabilities. And OPEC is one of these levers they're playing now where they're saying we don't need it anymore. We want to export as we see fit, not within the format of a bigger sort of alignment, certainly not within an alignment that's dominated by Saudi Arabia. We want to do what's in our national interest, and we're doing it as we see fit. And there are limitations to that autonomy because ultimately, if you look at the geography of it, they are prisoners of that geography. There are limitations of what the Emiratis can do on their own. And so OPEC is one of the levers they can play, but then a lot of other things have been pushed into the public domain where people are saying maybe Abu Dhabi is reconsidering membership in the Arab League, membership in the GCC. I think all that stuff is just a lot of narrative with no substance whatsoever, because after all, Abu Dhabi and the UAE understand they are part of a regional security complex that is Gulf-centric.
All right, fascinating to talk to you. Thank you so much, Andreas Krieg, talking to us there from King's College, London. And that's been Middle East Matters here on France 24's Around the World.